Hey guys, tonight we journey back to tables laden not with gold, but grit. A time when your sourdough starter would have been considered witchcraft, and you probably won't survive on vibes alone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself drifting back, way back. Picture this common image, the one that springs to mind when you hear peasant food. You see a rough-hewn wooden table, warmed by the glow of a nearby hearth. On it, perhaps, sits a crusty round loaf of dark bread, steam still coiling gently from its broken surface. Beside it, a simple earthenware bowl, cradling a thick, savory stew, dotted with hearty vegetables supposedly plucked fresh from a quaint kitchen garden just moments before. Maybe there's a wedge of hard cheese, a tankard of frothy ale. It's all very rustic, chic. Isn't it? Very Higa? Very summer cottagecore? You can almost smell the wood smoke, the herbs, the comforting simplicity. It's a compelling fantasy. This peasant plate, a vision of wholesome, uncomplicated sustenance, a direct line to the earth, a return to basics. We love to imagine this idyllic life where food was real, untainted by modern anxieties. But now, let's gently nudge that romanticized tapestry aside. Just a little. Let your eyes adjust to a slightly dimmer, perhaps grittier reality. That earthy flavor you're imagining. Well, sometimes it was. Quite literally, earth. The charmingly uneven texture of the bread, that might be thanks to a generous helping of sand from a poorly maintained millstone, or perhaps a bit of chaff and other uninvited guests that didn't quite make it through the sifting process. If there even was much of a sifting process, that hearty stew. It might indeed have vegetables, but perhaps not the plump, unblemished kind you select at the farmer's market. Think more along the lines of the slightly wilted, the foraged, the greens that grow stubbornly by the wayside, the ones that require a good deal of boiling to become even remotely palatable. The truth is, the peasant plate, for much of history, wasn't assembled from a place of idyllic choice or a conscious desire for whole foods. It was sculpted, almost entirely, by the unyielding hand of necessity. What you ate was what you could get, what you could grow in often uncooperative soil, what you could find, or what was left over. It's less farm to table and more whatever we found near the ditch to pot. This isn't to say there was no joy, no ingenuity, no moments of satisfaction. Far from it. But the driving force, the daily undercurrent, was survival. Every crumb, every scrap, every usable part of a plant, or, if they were fortunate, an animal, had value. Waste wasn't a concept to be railed against by eco-conscious bloggers. It was an impossibility, a fast track to hunger. Consider that staple, the bread. A mainstream historical fact, of course, is that the medieval peasant diet, and indeed, diets for centuries in many parts of the world, were overwhelmingly based on cereals. Bread, in various forms, was the staff of life. But your mind probably conjures images of artisanal sourdough, with a deeply caramelized crust and an open, chewy crumb. The reality, for many, was far different. You might be looking at bread made from rye, barley, oats, or even peas and beans, often coarsely ground. These grains could produce a heavy, dense loaf, sometimes so hard it needed to be soaked in whatever liquid was available. Water, thin ale, or the aforementioned stew, just to be chewable. And the color, often dark, not from wholesome whole grains alone, but sometimes from the inclusion of things like ground acorns, tree bark, or other extenders during lean times. Delicious, right? You can almost taste the desperation, this relentless pressure of necessity. However, led to some truly unexpected ingredients finding their way onto the peasant plate. Things that might make your modern palate curl, or at least raise an eyebrow. We're talking about a level of resourcefulness born from having no other option. Think about wild greens, not the curated selections you find in a gourmet salad mix, but nettles carefully prepared to remove the sting. Of course, dandelions, sorrel, chickweed, plants often dismissed as weeds today, were vital sources of nutrients. You'd learn to identify them from a young age, to know which ones would fill your belly and which might fill your grave. It's a skill set most of us have thankfully lost, because our grocery stores are blessedly free of existential dread in aisle 3. And it wasn't just plants. When meat was available, often a rare treat or reserved for special occasions for many, every single part of the animal was used. The concept of nose-to-tail eating is a trendy revival now, but for peasants, it was just Tuesday, offal, bones for broth that would be simmered for days, even blood would be incorporated into meals in ways that might seem, shall we say, adventurous to the modern diner. Historians still argue whether the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to settled agriculture truly improved the average peasant's daily caloric intake and nutritional diversity, or if, for many, it simply exchanged one set of hardships for another, albeit with a more predictable, if sometimes meager, food source. Here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit for you trenchers. No, not the coats. In medieval times, and even later in some places, plates as we know them weren't always common, especially among the poorer classes. Instead, they often used trenchers, thick, flat slabs of stale bread, a few days old. You'd pile your food onto this edible plate, and the bread would soak up the juices from the stew or meat. And what happened to the trencher afterwards? Well, if you were still hungry, you ate it. If you were truly destitute, or if it was too sodden and unappetizing even for you, it might be given to the dogs, or to even poorer beggars. Imagine that your plate is also part of your meal, or someone else's. It's a level of frugality that's hard to comprehend when you're used to ceramic or disposable options. Talk about reducing your washing up, perhaps the original zero-waste lifestyle, albeit one you wouldn't exactly choose. So, when you see those beautifully curated images of peasant fare in glossy food magazines or on picturesque Instagram feeds, remember this undercurrent of necessity. It wasn't about aesthetics or capturing the perfect flat lay. It was about staving off hunger, about making the most of incredibly limited resources. The simplicity we often romanticize was, in many cases, a stark reality with few alternatives. They weren't exactly debating the merits of organic versus conventional mud in their gruel. The creativity was there, undeniably, born from a deep understanding of the local environment and a desperate need to survive. But the romance, that's largely our modern projection, a comfortable lens through which to view a past that was often anything but comfortable. Imagine a food blogger back then, day 37 of Turnip Surprise, #blessed, #still mostly turnip. It just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? The peasant plate illusion is powerful, but tonight, we're gently peeling back its layers, looking for the often unseen truth beneath. So, you might be picturing endless bowls of lumpy oatmeal, maybe some watery gruel, and crusts of, well, rather uninspiring bread. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. That was certainly a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Or, let's be honest, most days for many, like we touched on with those basic staples. But tonight, we're venturing beyond that baseline into a world where what's for dinner, dineros, wasn't a casual question you idly pondered While scrolling through food delivery apps? No. It was a daily, sometimes hourly, puzzle. A constant negotiation with a very demanding partner. Sheer necessity. You feel it, don't you? That subtle, persistent hum beneath the surface of daily life. It's not the oops. I skipped lunch and now I'm a bit peckish feeling. This is a deeper, more resonant thrum of uncertainty. You wake up, and the first thought isn't about your to-do list, but about the stores in the larder, the flour in the sack. You walk through your dwelling, and your eyes automatically assess how much is left. Will it be enough? The air itself seems to carry the weight of this concern, especially when the rains don't come, or they come too much, or the frost bites too early, or too late. Scarcity isn't just an abstract economic concept here. It's a cold draft under the door, a knot in your stomach, a shadow that lengthens with the setting sun if the day's foraging or farming has yielded little. And then there's the rhythm of the seasons, an unyielding conductor of your culinary orchestra. And often, it only knows how to play one note at a time, very loudly. Imagine, if you will, your local supermarket, a beacon of modern abundance. Now, strip away 90% of what's on the shelves. For a few weeks in late summer, the empty spaces are suddenly, gloriously, filled with plums. Just plums. Plums everywhere. You'd eat fresh plums, stewed plums, dried plums, plum jam if you're lucky enough to have sugar, plum stuffed? Well, whatever else you had. You'd become a plum connoisseur, a plum artist, or, more likely, you'd reach a point where the mere sight of another plum makes you contemplate a life of quiet hermitude. That relentless seasonality dictated everything. No nipping out for strawberries in December, unless you were a king with a very fancy, very experimental greenhouse, which, let's face it, you probably aren't in this scenario. This stark reality, this limited palette, forced an incredible degree of creativity, or sometimes a quiet desperation. Nose-to-tail eating wasn't some trendy revival movement championed by chefs with impressive mustaches. It was just life. If you were fortunate enough to have an animal, say a pig, you used everything. The snout, the ears, the tail, the trotters, the wobbly bits that make some of us a bit squeamish today. It all went into the pot, or was preserved in some ingenious way. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. You learned to see potential in every scrap. That bit of gristle, render it down for fat, for flavor. Those bones, they become the heart of a broth that simmers for days, extracting every last whisper of nourishment. Your ancestors might have looked at your meticulously plated avocado toast and genuinely wondered why you weren't also toasting the pit, grinding it into a nutritious, if slightly woody meal supplement. Waste not, want not, especially when not wanting meant actual tangible hunger. The landscape around you transforms from a pretty backdrop into an open air, if somewhat unreliable, grocery store. You become intimately familiar with the edible offerings of the forest, the hedgerows, the verges of pathways. You learn to spot the tender nettle tops in spring, surprisingly good once boiled, a bit like spinach, the wild garlic, the dandelion greens, not just as weeds, but as vital supplements. You know which berries are safe, which mushrooms won't send you on an unexpected, and possibly final, psychedelic journey, and which nuts can be laboriously cracked and ground to add richness and protein. This wasn't a charming weekend hobby. It was a critical skill, passed down through generations. A mainstream historical fact, often repeated, is the terrifying reality of the Hungry Gap, that bleak period in late winter and early spring when last year's stores were dwindling to practically nothing, and the new season's growth was still just a tantalizing, fragile promise in the cold earth. That's when foraging skills became truly life or death. And what happened when creativity reached its limits? When the stores were empty and the land offered little, that's when desperation truly bit. The definition of edible could become alarmingly flexible. We're talking about things that would make a modern survivalist show contestant, the one who bravely eats a single grub, look like they're dining at a Michelin-starred establishment. Historians still argue whether the common person had any sophisticated understanding of nutritional balance, or if their choices were overwhelmingly dictated by the raw, urgent need for calories, any calories, to simply keep going. It's a sobering thought. Preservation, then, was paramount. Forget your fancy vacuum sealers and sprawling chest freezers. Here, you're relying on ancient, effective techniques: salting, smoking, drying, pickling. These weren't just methods to add flavor. They were essential for survival, for stretching precious resources through the lean months. You'd see rows of fish or strips of meat hanging in the smoky rafters, or buried in salt, a common and vital preservative. Your modern jerky subscription box, with its artisanal flavors and convenient packaging, has nothing on the sheer unadorned determination to make every morsel of food last as long as humanly possible. There's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit that people would sometimes go to great lengths to stretch their flour, especially during hard times. They weren't just mixing different grains. They might grind up dried pea pods, bean husks, or even certain types of cleaned and processed tree bark or ferns to add bulk. Not exactly your artisanal heritage grain sourdough, but it filled a hole, however uncomfortably. So, you see, the plate in front of you, if you were lucky enough to have one with something on it, told a complex story. It spoke of the season, of the recent harvest's success or failure, of your family's skill in foraging and preserving, and sometimes of how close to the edge you were truly living. It's a far cry from the effortless abundance many of us take for granted. A world where every mouthful was hard-won, and bread and gruel, while basic, were often a welcome sight indeed. The ingenuity born from such necessity is remarkable, a testament to human resilience. But it also paints a picture of a constant, underlying anxiety. A world away from worrying if your favorite brand of oat milk is in stock. Right. So, you've managed to put something aside? Haven't you? Maybe it's that slightly suspicious-looking loaf of bread we touched upon earlier, or perhaps a small sack of grain, a treasure in itself. You're feeling a sliver of security, a small, warm ember in the vast, chilly darkness of, well, of just trying to get by. You set your precious food down, maybe on a rough-hewn wooden table, or a cool stone slab in your dwelling. You take a moment, a breath, and then, as you prepare to portion it out, or perhaps just admire your foresight, you see it, a tiny flicker of movement where no movement should be. Your eyes narrow, you lean in closer, the dim light casting long. Dancing shadows, there, in your flour. Tiny dark specks are performing a slow, almost hypnotic waltz. Weevils, or maybe it's your dried fruit, and those little white worms are just, well, they're just there. Aren't they? Suddenly, your stomach does a little flip, not entirely from hunger anymore. This, my friend, is where your carefully acquired meal starts to reveal its hidden depths, its uninvited cohabitants. It's when your food, in a very tiny, very persistent way, fights back, or at least shares itself with others. You see, keeping critters out of food has been a monumental, often losing, battle throughout history. We're talking insects, rodents, all sorts of small scurrying, scuttling things that view your pantry as their personal, all-you-can-eat buffet. It wasn't a matter of poor housekeeping, not always. The very nature of food storage, especially before the advent of hermetically sealed everything and industrial-grade pesticides, was an open invitation. Imagine those vast granaries, the ones that fed entire Roman legions. A mainstream historical fact. For you, the Romans were so serious about their grain supply. They even had a goddess, Annona, dedicated to it. And their public granaries, the Horea Almsoi, were engineering marvels of their time, designed with raised floors and thick walls to deter pests. But even these weren't foolproof. You'd have grain moths laying their eggs, their larvae happily munching away. You'd have beetles boring tiny, perfect holes into each kernel. It's almost artistic, in a deeply unappetizing way. And it's not just the raw ingredients. You might have carefully salted your meat, hung it to dry, feeling quite pleased with your preservation skills, but then you notice the telltale signs of mites, or worse, the larvae of flies, transforming your hard-won protein into something else, something squirming. Cheese, that delightful concentration of milk and thyme, could develop its own little ecosystem. Some of those, like the cheese mites on a mimolette, are even considered a delicacy by some today, or at least a sign of authenticity. But back then, finding your cheese practically walking off the shelf with skippers might have been less artisanal and more, for goodness sake. Again, it's a gentle sarcasm, of course, mostly. Then there are the rodents. The mice and rats. Nature's tiny furry ninjas, capable of squeezing through impossibly small gaps, their whiskers twitching, always sensing where the next meal might be. You might hear them in the walls, a soft, almost imperceptible skittering sound that becomes part of the night's ambient noise. They'd chew through sacks, leaving behind their little calling cards, and perhaps taking a sample of everything. It's like they were tiny, unhygienic food critics, sampling everything on the menu. This oat needs more nibbling. The processing conditions didn't always help either. When you're grinding grain with a simple stone quern, as many did for centuries, anything that was in the grain often got ground with the grain. A bit of extra protein, perhaps unintentional, of course, but there it was. Small insects, their eggs, bits of things you'd rather not contemplate, all becoming part of the flour, part of the eventual bread or porridge. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the staff of life might have had a few extra legs. It's fascinating, in a slightly unsettling way, how accustomed people became to this. Not that they enjoyed it, mind you, but the effort required for absolute purity was often beyond the means of the average person. You'd pick out what you could. You'd sift. You'd brush things off. Sometimes you'd just cook it thoroughly and try not to think about it too much. Ignorance, in this case, might genuinely have been a form of bliss, or at least a digestive aid. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. The ancient Egyptians were quite meticulous about their grain storage, but they still had pest problems. Archaeologists have found traces of rodent bones and insect remains in grain silos dating back thousands of years. They even had cats, of course, the original furry pest controllers, but even a legion of felines couldn't guard every single grain. Some cultures, though, did intentionally incorporate insects into their diet. But that's a different story than finding them as unwelcome guests. However, it does blur the lines a bit, doesn't it? When does an infestation become an ingredient? A question for the philosophers, perhaps, or just very hungry people. Historians still argue whether the general acceptance of these contaminants was due to a higher tolerance for what we'd now consider unsanitary, or simply a pragmatic understanding of the near impossibility of complete eradication before modern technology. Was it a blasé attitude, or just weary resignation? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle. You deal with what you have to deal with. Think about open-air markets, a vibrant, chaotic, wonderful part of life for centuries, but also a place where food was exposed. Flies would buzz, settling where they pleased. A bit of dust, a stray feather, a curious ant exploring a pile of dates. It was all part of the tapestry. Your beautiful, ripe fruit might have a tiny wormhole, a secret tunnel leading to a hidden resident. You might not even notice until you take a bite. Surprise. Even when you try to be careful, nature is persistent. You seal your clay pots of honey or oil as best you can, maybe with a piece of cloth and some wax. But time and tiny, determined creatures can find a way. Ants, especially, are masters of infiltration. They can form a living chain, a tiny, six-legged bucket brigade. To access the sweetest treasures, you have to admire their tenacity, even as you curse their success. It's a far cry from our modern, shrink-wrapped, sanitized world, where finding a single fruit fly in your kitchen can feel like a major biohazard event. We have standards now, regulations about acceptable levels of insect fragments or rodent hairs in processed foods. Yes, you heard that right. Acceptable levels, even today. With all our technology, absolute purity is a high bar. It just makes you wonder about the unacceptable levels people routinely encountered in the past, without the comfort of a government agency to set a limit. They just had their stomachs, and perhaps a strong constitution, or maybe just no other choice. It's one of those things that makes you appreciate that plastic wrap just a little bit more, doesn't it? Or maybe it makes you want to invest in a really, really fine sieve. So, as you peer at that little something extra in your meal, you're connecting with a timeless human experience, the discovery that you're not the only one interested in dinner. It's a shared table, in the broadest sense. And sometimes, your dinner companions are very, very small and very, very uninvited. You just try to breathe, maybe sigh a little, and carry on. After all, you're still hungry, aren't you? Mambi. And so, with that image of a rather questionable water source still fresh in your mind, let's consider what else might be mingling with your meal. Because tonight, we're not just talking about food. We're talking about its almost constant companions, the uninvited spice rack of dirt, debris, and all sorts of unexpected extras. You see, the journey from field, or forest, or even the most basic larder, to your plate, or, more likely, your wooden trencher or communal bowl is fraught with opportunities for contamination. Think about your modern kitchen for a moment. Sealed countertops, stainless steel sinks, running water, little spray bottles of antibacterial everything. Now, gently sweep all of that away. You're left with something far more elemental. Basic food preparation, as you'd know it, is a primary culprit. You're probably cooking over an open hearth. Remember a charming, rustic image, isn't it? Until you consider the constant rain of ash, soot, and whatever else the chimney decides to cough up, that lovely smoky flavor infusing your pottage. Some of it is intentional, sure, but a surprising amount is just atmospheric fallout. Your cooking pot, hanging precariously over the flames, is an open invitation, and the floor beneath your feet. It's likely packed earth, maybe some rushes strewn about that haven't been changed since last Tuesday, or the Tuesday before that. Every time you move, every time a draft wafts through those unglazed windows we talked about, a little cloud of dust rises, some of it inevitably settling into whatever you're stirring. It's like a very, very subtle seasoning that nobody asked for. Ah, a hint of earthen floor in this gruel. Delightful, said no one. Ever, with genuine enthusiasm. Then there's the milling of grains, your daily bread, a staple for so many throughout history, often came with a little extra. Let's call it texture. Stone grinding. The method used for centuries inevitably meant that tiny particles of the millstone itself would chip off and mix with the flour. It's a well-documented issue, for instance. The ancient Egyptians and Romans often contended with significant amounts of sand and grit in their bread, partly from the desert environment, but also from these stone grinding techniques. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It contributed to serious dental wear over a lifetime. Imagine every bite of bread, a tiny act of abrasion against your teeth. Over years, that adds up. So when you're sinking your teeth into a dense, dark loaf, you might also be getting an unexpected lesson in geology. Fun and the surfaces you're working on. Forget that gleaming butcher block. Your table is probably a rough-hewn plank of wood, full of crevices and pores where food particles, dirt, and who knows what else can happily reside. You wipe it down, perhaps with a damp cloth, if water is plentiful enough to spare for such luxuries. But truly, sanitizing it. That's a concept far off in the future. Your knife, too, likely wiped on a cloth of dubious cleanliness, or perhaps just on your apron, which has seen its own share of experiences. Now, let's turn our gaze to the produce. If you're lucky enough to have fresh fruits and vegetables, they're arriving with much of their natural habitat still attached. That apple you're about to bite into. It wasn't lovingly polished and displayed under soft supermarket lighting. It was plucked from a tree, maybe dropped on the ground, and then tossed into a basket with its equally unkempt brethren. You might give it a quick wipe on your sleeve, but the idea of a thorough scrubbing, let alone a vinegar soak or a fancy vegetable wash, is just not happening. The soil itself, remember, is where this food grew, and that soil was often fertilized with animal manure. While composting can neutralize many pathogens, the processes weren't always perfectly understood or managed. So, a fine layer of what used to be, well, fertilizer, might still be clinging to your carrots or your lettuce. You might rinse them if you have access to relatively clean water and the inclination, but a quick dip isn't going to dislodge every microscopic particle or every speck of field dirt kicked up by the wind or a passing cart. Historians still argue whether the general populace had a high tolerance for this level of contamination due to constant exposure, or if it was a persistent source of low-level gut distress that was simply accepted as part of life. It's a bit like us with pollen in the spring, perhaps an unavoidable seasonal affliction. But for them, it was more of a year-round dietary feature. You just sort of chewed carefully. And it's not just dirt. Your lovely head of cabbage, or that handful of freshly gathered greens, might also house a few tiny, uninvited guests, a stray aphid, a sleepy caterpillar, perhaps a minuscule beetle. Think of it as unsolicited bonus protein. Today, we recoil at the thought of a bug in our salad. Back then, it was probably so common that you'd just discreetly pick it out, or, if you weren't paying much attention, accidentally ingest it. Gives a whole new meaning to a little extra crunch, doesn't it? And it certainly wasn't triple washed, pre-bagged spinach. You were lucky if it saw water once, between the field and the pot. Then there's the storage. Oh, the joys of historical food storage. Even if your food started out relatively clean, its temporary home before consumption could introduce a whole new cast of contaminants. Your grains, wheat, barley, rye, are stored in sacks or bins, often in a cool, dark place. Sounds sensible, right? But these places are also prime real estate for pantry pests. Weevils in the flour, beetles in the dried beans, moth larvae in the oats. These creatures don't just eat your food. They also leave behind their frass, a polite term for insect excrement, shed skins, and sometimes their tiny little selves. So, when you scoop out some flour, you're often getting a bit more than just ground wheat. It adds a certain something, probably not flavor. Rodents, too, were a constant presence. Mice and rats, bolder and far more numerous than we generally tolerate today, would find their way into pantries and cellars. A stray dropping, a shed hair. These could easily end up in the food supplies. You try to keep things covered. Of course, using wooden lids or heavy cloths. But a determined rodent is a persistent foe. And remember, these aren't the relatively clean city pigeons you might see today. These are creatures living in much closer proximity to all sorts of filth. Dust, as we mentioned with the kitchen, is an ever-present film. It settles from the rafters, from the thatched roof, from the very walls of your dwelling, onto stored foods. Cobwebs weren't just a sign of poor housekeeping. They were an almost inevitable fixture, and bits of them could drift down. It's a bit like having a house cat that sheds constantly, but instead of fur, it's ancient dust and the occasional spiderweb fragment. Adds character, I suppose. This brings us to the more general category of foreign objects. Beyond the natural contaminants like soil and insect bits, there's a whole world of other things that could randomly appear in your food. A human hair, from the cook, a family member, or even someone at the market. A splinter of wood from a worn barrel or a cracked bowl. Small pebbles or larger pieces of grit that managed to escape the sifting process for flour or dried peas. Bits of straw or chaff from the threshing floor, still clinging to grains. It's actually quite interesting. This aspect of dining, one rather quirky tidbit, is that in medieval and early modern times, particularly among the more well-to-do diners, often had what were called voiders. These weren't just napkins. They could be special dishes or designated cloths placed on the table specifically for people to discreetly spit out unchewable bits found in their food. A fishbone, a piece of gristle, or, yes, a bit of grit or a small stone. It suggests an acknowledgement that such finds were not entirely unexpected. You wouldn't make a fuss. You'd just void it. Imagine doing that at a fancy restaurant today. Waiter, my voider, if you please. It might not go over so well. So, you're there, about to enjoy your meal. You take a bite of bread, and there's that familiar, sandy crunch. You find a tiny beetle in your stew and casually flick it aside. Maybe you chew on something that's definitely not food, and you use your voider, or just subtly remove it. It's not ideal. It's certainly not hygienic by our standards, but it's a part of the daily reality. This constant po-level assault of foreign matter was just something you lived with. It's a testament to the resilience of the human digestive system. Really. Though, one does wonder how many upset stomachs and unexplained ailments were simply due to this uninvited spice rack. It's enough to make you appreciate that pre-washed lettuce a little bit more, isn't it? And so, after you've, perhaps, creatively repurposed every last crumb from that rather sparse pantry we were just imagining, after you've stared into the abyss of an empty flour sack, what then? When the ingenuity inside the kitchen walls reaches its limit, your gaze, much like the gaze of countless generations before you, inevitably drifts outwards, past the carefully tended, if somewhat meager garden plot, beyond the struggling fence line, and into what you might generously call the wilderness, or, less generously, the weeds. Yes, we're venturing into the world of weeds with intent, the purposeful gathering of wild plants, a practice born sometimes of stark necessity, sometimes of deep-rooted tradition, and always blurring those fascinating lines between what we consider food and what we might just call filler. You see, it's one thing to pluck a dandelion for a rustic salad because it's trendy and you saw it on a cooking show. It's quite another when that dandelion, with its surprisingly peppery kick, represents a vital source of vitamin C that's standing between your family and the less than charming effects of scurvy. This purposeful inclusion wasn't about horticultural flair. It was often about survival. You're not just admiring the tenacity of a plant pushing through a crack in the paving stones. You're assessing its potential contribution to the evening meal. You can almost feel the rough texture of its leaves under your fingertips, the slight stickiness of its stem, the economic reality for many, for vast stretches of history, was that the cultivated field or the local market simply couldn't provide enough. Think of the lean months before the harvest, or times of drought, or the aftermath of conflict when supply lines, much like your patience with yet another turnip, were utterly broken. This is where the local flora, the uninvited guests in your yard, suddenly look a lot more appealing. It's a bit like today, when you're down to your last instant noodle packet, and suddenly that slightly bruised apple at the back of the fridge looks like gourmet fare. Except, you know, with potentially more dirt involved. And these wild additions, they ran the gamut. Some were nutritional powerhouses, a veritable pharmacy growing freely. Take the humble stinging nettle, for instance. Once you get past its, shall we say, assertive defense mechanism, and there were clever ways to do that, often involving a good blanching, you'd find a plant packed with iron, vitamins, even a decent amount of protein. You can imagine the slightly metallic, earthy scent as it wilts in a pot, transforming from a menace into a nourishing pottage. Dandelions, too. Those cheerful yellow faces are practically bursting with goodness. Their leaves, their roots, even their flowers found their way into human diets, offering a bitter but beneficial boost. Remember that slightly acrid taste we talked about with some of those ersatz coffees? Chicory root, often foraged, provided a similar bitter note, extending precious coffee supplies or replacing them altogether. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, you find the plants that were less celebrated for their nutritional profile and more for their sheer bulk. Sometimes, the primary goal wasn't a balanced diet. It was simply the sensation of fullness, a way to quiet the relentless gnawing in your stomach. Certain grasses, their seeds painstakingly collected, might offer carbohydrate, but not much else. Or think of tree bark, the inner cambium layer of certain species, ground down and added to meager flower supplies to make it stretch. It's not exactly a superfood, is it? You can almost taste the woody, slightly resinous quality, the way it would stubbornly refuse to fully soften, a testament to how far one might go. Historians still argue whether the persistent inclusion of some incredibly bitter or texturally challenging wild plants in historical diets was a sign of an acquired taste, a genuine appreciation for their unique flavors developed over centuries, or if it was simply a stark indicator of how little else there was to eat. It's a debate that highlights the desperation, but also the adaptability of people. This is where that line between food and filler becomes wonderfully, and sometimes worryingly, blurred. Is a plant food if it primarily stops hunger pangs, but offers little nourishment? Is it food if it requires extensive, careful preparation to leach out toxins? A process you undertake because the alternative is even grimmer. The answer for many was a resounding, yes, of course, it is. It had to be. You're not just eating, you're engaging in a primal act of resourcefulness. It's a well-documented mainstream historical fact that during periods of intense rationing, like during World War II in Britain, government campaigns actively encouraged foraging. Dig for Victory wasn't just about cultivating gardens. Pamphlets and radio shows taught people how to identify and use wild edibles like rose hips for vitamin C syrup or fat hen as a spinach substitute. Suddenly, knowledge that might have been fading was thrust back into vital importance. You can picture city dwellers, far removed from ancestral rural know-how, tentatively exploring parks and hedgerows, guide in hand. And for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit in some regions, specific famine weeds were known to be mildly toxic, but were consumed anyway after elaborate preparations. For instance, the seeds of corn cockle, a common weed in grain fields, are poisonous. Yet, there are accounts of them being meticulously separated from wheat, then sometimes ground and used in small, risky amounts to extend flour during extreme scarcity. A grim gamble between slow starvation and potential poisoning. It's a chilling reminder of the choices faced. You wouldn't find that recipe in your glossy modern foraging guide, would you? Probably for the best. This purposeful foraging wasn't always a last resort. However, over generations, some of these wild plants became integral to regional cuisines, woven into the fabric of tradition. Think of wild garlic or ramps, eagerly anticipated in the spring. Their pungent aroma a promise of fresh flavors after a long winter, or wild berries, painstakingly gathered for jams, pies, and wines, their sweetness a seasonal treasure. These weren't just about staving off hunger, they were about flavor, about identity, about rituals passed down from grandmother to grandchild. The annual mushroom hunt in many cultures, the specific greens used in a traditional spring soup. These practices transform weeds into cherished ingredients, their inclusion a celebration, not just a necessity. You can almost feel the damp forest floor underfoot, the thrill of spotting a patch of chanterelles, their golden hue a beacon in the undergrowth. So, as you ponder the contents of your own well-stocked, or perhaps not so well-stocked refrigerator, take a moment to appreciate the silent, often unthanked, larder that grows just beyond our cultivated spaces. These weeds with intent tell a story of resilience, of deep ecological knowledge, and of a human spirit that refuses to be limited by the contents of a conventional pantry. They are a reminder that sustenance, and even delight, can be found in the most unexpected of places, if only you know where and how to look. Right then, you've successfully navigated the complexities of acquiring food, perhaps through that painstaking hunt we touched upon earlier, or maybe by carefully tending to those few precious domesticated animals. The real work, the part that separates the truly resourceful from those who might, shall we say, prefer their protein neatly packaged and anonymous, begins now. We're venturing into the world of nose-to-tail eating, and honestly, it's more like nose to tail and every stray hair and sinew in between. Because when resources are as tight as a newly strung bow, you don't just toss out the icky bits. That's a luxury you simply can't afford. It's about honoring the life taken. Yes, but more pragmatically, it's about squeezing every last drop of sustenance from it. So, the animal is before you. The prime cuts, the ones you might recognize, are relatively easy. But what about the heart, that powerful muscle? You clean it carefully, trimming away the tougher valves and vessels, sliced thin and cooked quickly over a fire. It's surprisingly tender, with a rich irony taste that's quite distinct. The liver. Now that's a powerhouse of vitamins. You might find it a bit strong for your modern palate, perhaps, but seared with some wild onions, if you were lucky enough to forage them like we discussed, it becomes something almost decadent. Kidneys, too, require careful preparation. Soaking them helps to mellow their assertive flavor. You learn to appreciate these strong tastes, or at least, you learn to disguise them artfully with whatever herbs and wild spices you've managed to gather. And brains. Well, brains are a bit of a textural adventure. Aren't they creamy? Rich in fats, often scrambled with other ingredients, or perhaps gently poached. Some find them a delicacy. Others find them a reason to suddenly become very interested in sharpening arrowheads. Then there's the blood. Oh yes, the blood. You don't just let that spill onto the earth. not if you can help it. It's carefully collected, warm and viscous, into a clean vessel, perhaps a clay pot, or even a hollowed gourd. This isn't just waste. It's potential, mixed with grains, if you have them, or breadcrumbs from that dense, chewy bread we imagined, and seasoned with precious spices. It becomes a rich, dark sausage. The practice of making blood sausage, or black pudding as it's known in many parts of the world, is ancient, a testament to this very principle of using everything. You carefully fill cleaned intestinal casings, more on those delightful items in a moment, and then simmer or smoke your creations. It's a way to preserve, to concentrate flavor, and to ensure nothing valuable is lost. You might even use a little fresh blood to thicken stews, adding a unique depth and richness that, while perhaps unsettling to think about now, was a cornerstone of hearty cooking. And the bones. Ah, the bones are treasures in themselves. You crack open the larger ones, those sturdy femurs and tibias, to get at the marrow. Scooped out warm, it's like the richest, most savory butter you can imagine. Pure energy, spread on a piece of rough bread or eaten straight. It's almost a primal comfort. But even after the marrow is gone, the bones keep giving. You simmer them for hours, days even, with water and any vegetable scraps you might have. This slow extraction creates a nourishing broth, a warm, comforting liquid that can sustain you when other foods are scarce. It coaxes out collagen, minerals, and a depth of flavor that forms the base of so many meals. Remember that constant gnawing hunger we talked about? A cup of warm bone broth can feel like a feast. Some smaller, more delicate bones might be sharpened into needles for sewing those rough-spun clothes, or carved into beads for simple adornment. Historians still argue whether the specific selection of animal bones for tools was purely utilitarian, or if certain bones were believed to carry specific properties or luck. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? That a simple awl made from a deer's ulna might have been more than just a tool. Now, let's get to the parts that truly test your commitment, the bits that modern butchers often discreetly send to the, well, somewhere else. The skin. For instance, if it's from a pig, you might score it, salt it, and roast it until it's unbelievably crispy and crackling. A salty, fatty treat that's pure indulgence. Other animal skins, if prepared correctly, become leather, vital for clothing, shelter, or making sturdy containers. The tendons and tougher connective tissues. You boil them down, a long, slow process, until they render their gelatin. This gelatin can be used to set savory jellies or pottages, adding body and a surprising amount of protein. Think of it as ancient Jell-O, but probably flavored with smoked meat instead of lime. A definite improvement, if you ask me. And the feet, the ears, the snout. These are often rich in cartilage and connective tissue, perfect for those long-simmered dishes that yield a wonderfully gelatinous, lip-sticking texture. Boiled pig's trotters or cow's heel might not be topping any modern foodie influencer's list, but they were calorie-dense and, with the right slow cooking and seasoning, surprisingly palatable. It's all about extraction and transformation. Even the intestines, which we mentioned for sausage casings, require meticulous, and let's be honest, rather unglamorous cleaning. It's a painstaking job, flushing and scraping, but the reward is a perfect, natural casing for preserving your seasoned meats. A quirky little tidbit for you in some cultures, cleaned and inflated animal bladders were actually used as rudimentary canteens, or even as buoyant, if somewhat fragile, children's toys. Imagine batting around a dried pig's bladder for fun. Different times. My friends, different times. You see, this isn't just about avoiding waste. It's a profound understanding of the animal and the environment. Every single piece had a purpose, a potential, It required knowledge, patience, and a distinct lack of squeamishness that we, in our comfortably sterile modern world, can barely comprehend. The rendering of fat into tallow for candles or cooking, the use of hooves for glue, the careful drying of every last scrap of meat into jerky. It was all part of a cycle of complete utilization. There's a certain quiet dignity in this approach, a deep respect woven into the very fabric of survival. You're not just eating, you're participating in a much older, much more fundamental contract with nature, and you're making sure that when you finally sit down to eat, you've earned every single, slightly unusual bite. It makes you wonder what unappealing bits of our own lives we're discarding without a second thought, doesn't it? Probably nothing as tasty as a well-cooked tripe. Though, probably. And just when you think you've mastered the art of keeping things pristine, you encounter the quiet, persistent artists of the microbial world, the mold and fungus. You see them as these delicate, sometimes surprisingly beautiful, blooms that can appear as if from nowhere. They are, in truth, everywhere. Tiny spores drifting on the air currents, just waiting for the right conditions, a little moisture, a bit of forgotten food, to settle down and start their fuzzy, intricate work. Think of them as nature's tiny, often uninvited, interior decorators, always ready for a makeover. Now, sometimes you actually invite these guests to the party. You walk over to your cheese drawer, and there it is, that glorious wedge of Roquefort, its creamy paste marbled with striking blue-green veins. Those veins, that's Penicillium roqueforti, a fungus deliberately introduced to give the cheese its characteristic sharp, tangy flavor and crumbly texture. You might sniff it, and a pungent, almost metallic aroma fills your senses. A smell that screams sophistication, or possibly old socks, depending on your persuasion. It's a culinary gamble that often pays off spectacularly. Then you have your brie, or camembert, with their soft, bloomy rinds. That delicate white, almost velvety coating is thanks to Penicillium camemberti. It's a fungus that works from the outside in, ripening the cheese, making it ooey-gooey and perfect for spreading on a crusty piece of bread. Remember how we talked about controlled environments for preservation? Well, cheesemakers are masters of this, creating the perfect humid, cool conditions for these specific molds to thrive while keeping others at bay. It's like curating a very exclusive, very funky art show. And it's not just cheese. Think about soy sauce, that umami bomb you drizzle over your sushi. Its complex, savory depth comes from Aspergillus oryzae, yes? Or koji, a mold that works its magic on soybeans and wheat. This same industrious fungus is responsible for miso and tempeh, transforming simple ingredients into nutrient-rich, flavor-packed staples. Some traditional cured sausages even develop a fine, powdery mold on their casing during the aging process, contributing to their unique flavor profile and helping to protect the meat. It's a testament to human ingenuity, really. Looking at something that usually signals danger and saying, I wonder if I can eat that if I do it just right. Of course, the most famous accidental fungal superstar wasn't initially for eating. You've heard of Alexander Fleming, right? Back in 1928, he returned from holiday to find one of his Staphylococcus culture plates contaminated with a mold, Penicillium notatum. CE. Around the mold, the bacteria weren't growing. This observation, this happy little accident, led to the development of penicillin, an antibiotic that has saved countless millions of lives. It's a pretty mainstream historical fact, but it's always astonishing to think how a bit of rogue fluff changed medicine forever. Talk about an unexpected benefit. But then, there's the other side of the bloom, the unintentional, unwelcome kind. You reach for that loaf of bread you bought just a few days ago, and there, nestled on the crust, are those telltale fuzzy spots, perhaps a dusty green, a stark white, or even a sinister black. Or you open the crisper drawer, searching for that vibrant orange bell pepper, only to find it looking a bit deflated and sporting a soft, white fur coat. This is mold in its more common and far less appealing role, the great decomposer of your grocery budget. It's a sign that moisture, warmth, and perhaps a little too much time have conspired against your culinary plans. Remember all those efforts we discussed about keeping food dry, and cool mold is precisely why. It loves a damp, cozy environment. Your forgotten Tupperware at the back of the fridge can become a veritable science experiment, a tiny, self-contained ecosystem showcasing the diverse palette of fungal growth. Sometimes you open one of those, and it's like, congratulations, you've cultivated a new life form. Now, please, for the love of all that is holy, throw it out from a distance. That's one of my light jokes, by the way. Or is it just sound advice? The risks here are not just about an off taste or an unappetizing appearance. Many molds produce mycotoxins, which are toxic compounds that can cause a range of health problems, from acute poisoning to long-term effects like immune deficiency and cancer. Aflatoxins, for example, produced by certain Aspergillus species, can contaminate improperly stored grains, nuts, and corn. This is a serious global food safety concern. So, that question you always ask yourself, can I just cut the moldy part off? Ain't? For hard cheeses or firm fruits and vegetables, if the mold is just a small spot, the general advice is often yes, cut away a generous margin around it. But for soft, porous foods like bread, soft cheeses, jams, or that questionable leftover casserole the mold's hyphae, its root-like structures can penetrate deep into the food, unseen. It's better to be safe and discard the whole thing. It's a bit like seeing one tiny ant in your kitchen. You just know it has friends you can't see. My apologies to any ants listening. I'm sure you're mostly very polite. That's joke number 2, for those keeping score at home. Speaking of ancient practices, here's a quirky little tidbit for you ancient Egyptians. Thousands of years ago, reportedly used moldy bread as a poultice on infected wounds. They wouldn't have understood the science, of course. No knowledge of penicillium or antibiotic properties. But they observed that sometimes it seemed to help. It's a fascinating glimpse into early empirical medicine. A sort of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Or in this case, slap some fuzzy bread on it and hope for the best. One wonders if the patient was more worried about the infection or the bread. The world of fungi is vast and complex, and its relationship with human food sources is a long and often contentious one. In fact, historians still argue whether the widespread medieval consumption of rye bread contaminated with ergot fungus was a significant contributing factor to outbreaks of dancing mania or St. Anthony's fire, or if those were primarily due to other social and psychological pressures. Ergot-contaminated rye could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene, truly terrifying symptoms. So, while some fungi give us delectable cheeses and life-saving medicines, others have a much darker history. It's a reminder that these tiny organisms wield considerable power, like that one tiny Lego brick you step on in the dark, small, but mighty in its impact. And there's your third joke, subtle, yet painful if you've experienced it. So, you see, this mysterious bloom, whether it's the carefully cultivated blue in your Stilton or the unwelcome guest on your week-old strawberries, plays a significant role in our world. It's a delicate dance between deliciousness and danger, between intentional cultivation and unintentional spoilage. Understanding its nature helps you navigate your kitchen and maybe even appreciate the complex, often invisible, forces that shape your food. Next time you see a bit of mold, perhaps you'll pause for a moment, just before you sensibly dispose of it, if it's the bad kind. Of course, and marvel at its tenacity. Or, just wrinkle your nose and reach for the bin. Both are perfectly acceptable reactions. So, you've managed to gather your ingredients, perhaps after a long day of work or navigating those tricky market stalls we talked about. You're ready to prepare a meal, or maybe just enjoy a simple cup of tea, a slice of bread. You settle down, take a bite, a sip, and you can't help but feel that something is off, not quite right. It's a subtle unease at first, a texture that's a little too gritty, a color that's a shade too vibrant, a taste that whispers of something other than what it claims to be. Welcome, my friend, to the all-too-common reality of stretching the scraps, where adulteration and substitutes were not just a sneaky trick, but often a widespread practice. You see, when an ingredient was expensive, like those exotic spices that traveled halfway across the world, or when it was scarce due to a bad harvest or a distant war, the temptation to make a little go a long way was immense. It's simple economics, really, even if the results were anything but simple for the poor soul consuming it. Your precious flour, for instance, might be extended with some rather unappetizing additions. We're talking chalk dust, ground up beans not the fancy kind, plaster of Paris, or even fine sawdust. Imagine that comforting loaf of bread, the staff of life, now carrying a secret, gritty heart, that extra crunch in your biscuit, probably not a forgotten, very tiny, and suspiciously earthy nut. It makes you wonder if our modern anxieties about food additives are really so new, or just a continuation of a very old story. And it wasn't just about bulking things out. Sometimes ingredients were replaced entirely. Your milkman, a cheerful chap perhaps, might be delivering something that was more water than milk, artfully whitened with a touch of chalk, or, if he was feeling particularly inventive, even mashed sheep's brains to give it that creamy consistency. Yes, you heard that right. It gives a whole new meaning to mindful eating. Doesn't it, sugar? That sweet delight we've seen become more common over time could be cut with sand. Very fine sand, mind you. They weren't complete monsters or powdered stone, just enough to add weight and volume, stretching the profit margin just a little bit further. Then there's the visual deception. Appearance, as we know, is everything. Or at least it was a big part of fooling the discerning, or not so discerning, customer. Bright green pickles achieved with a dash of copper sulfate, which, while giving a lovely vibrant hue, is decidedly not on any recommended dietary intake list. Your sweets, those colorful little temptations, might owe their cheerful yellows and reds to lead-based pigments, deliciously toxic. Even cheese wasn't safe. That rich golden color could come from annatto, which is harmless enough, but sometimes from things like red lead. It was a bit like a magic show, really, except instead of a rabbit from a hat, it was often something you really didn't want to find in your food, disguised as something you did. Coffee, that beloved brew, was a prime candidate for trickery. Ground coffee could be, and often was, mixed with roasted chicory, acorns, carrots, or even good old-fashioned dirt, all roasted and ground to resemble the real thing. Tea, too, suffered. Remember how we talked about those long, perilous journeys spices and tea had to make? Well, once it arrived, used tea leaves might be bought up on the cheap, re-dried, and then freshened up. And how, you ask, did they achieve this miraculous rejuvenation? sometimes with a bit of sheep's dung for color and texture, or, for a particularly fetching shade of black, a touch of Prussian blue, a pigment which, rather alarmingly, contains cyanide. It certainly puts a new spin on your morning cuppa. This little quirky tidbit about reprocessed tea leaves, often using substances you wouldn't want anywhere near your mouth, shows the lengths some would go to. Now, you might be thinking this was all just unchecked villainy, and in many cases, it certainly leaned that way. Their motto seemed to be, if it doesn't kill them immediately, it's probably fine. A sort of culinary Russian roulette, if you will, but with more chalk. However, there were attempts, even quite early on, to regulate these practices. A mainstream historical fact for you, as far back as 1266 in England, the assize of bread and ale was established. This law aimed to control the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer, punishing bakers or brewers who sold substandard goods. Bakers who sold underweight loaves, for example, could be fined or even put in the pillory, a rather public form of shaming. Did it stop adulteration entirely? Of course not. Where there's a rule, there's usually someone trying to find a loophole, especially when profit is involved or ingredients are genuinely hard to come by. The sheer range of adulterants is quite staggering when you look into it. Pepper, a valuable spice, could be bulked up with mustard husks, pea flour, or something charmingly referred to as pepper dust, which was basically just floor sweepings from the warehouse. Cayenne pepper might get a fiery boost from red lead. Even beer wasn't safe from the enhancers. Substances like picric acid, explosive and toxic, could be added to mimic the bitter taste of hops, or Iliu swan yatai, iron sulfate, to give it a good head of foam. It makes you appreciate the rigorous food safety standards we often take for granted today, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether this rampant corner cutting was born more from the cynical, profit-chasing greed of unscrupulous vendors, or if it was sometimes the desperate act of small-time sellers just trying to make ends meet in a world where pure ingredients were a luxury few could consistently afford. Perhaps it was a bit of both. You can imagine a baker struggling to source good flour at a reasonable price, feeling the pressure to add something to make his loaves the expected size and whiteness. Knowing his customers couldn't afford the pure version anyway, alum, for instance, was commonly added to bread to make it whiter and heavier, appealing to the eye and the scales, but it's an astringent and not exactly great for your digestive system. It's a rather unsettling thought, isn't it? That the very things meant to nourish you, to sustain you through your day, could be actively working against you, filled with inert, indigestible, or even actively harmful substances. You'd take a bite of bread, and instead of wholesome grain, you might be ingesting a little bit of the earth itself, or worse. The daily act of eating became a gamble, a quiet hope that what you were consuming was, at the very least, not going to make you immediately unwell. So, as you picture those historical tables laden with food, remember to add a little pinch of skepticism to the scene, a silent question mark over every dish, because stretching the scraps was an art form, albeit a rather dubious and sometimes dangerous one. Oh? So, you're feeling a bit parched. Are you, after all that, vigorous activity we discussed earlier, like perhaps trying to navigate a crowded medieval street without getting something unspeakable splashed on your boots? You reach for a drink, but what exactly are you reaching for? Forget your fancy triple-filtered, UV sterilized, electrolyte-enhanced H2O. We're diving into the original source, the lifeblood of settlements, and often the express lane to an upset stomach, or worse. Welcome to the world of historical hydration, or as I like to call it, river soup. You wander down to the local river, the same one that, just a little upstream, services the tannery with its delightful chemical runoff. the butcher who might be rinsing down his chopping blocks, and, of course, countless other households contributing their daily, offerings. You see, the concept of separating drinking water from, let's call it, multi-purpose community drainage wasn't always top of mind. The water might look clearish on a good day, or it might have a certain body to it, a silty richness that you try to tell yourself is just, minerals. You dip your wooden cup, or perhaps a rough clay jug, into the flow. It's cool, at least. That's something. Of course, it's not just rivers. There are wells, laboriously dug and, with any luck, lined with stone. But wells, especially shallow ones in porous ground, are just collecting groundwater. And guess what else seeps into groundwater? Everything, especially if your well is conveniently located near the communal midden heap or, heaven forbid, a graveyard. Sometimes, to combat the general sliminess or the taste, people would introduce eels into their wells. The thinking was that the eels would eat the algae and other gunk, keeping the water clean. It's a charmingly organic solution, isn't it? Eels nibbling away at the debris and, well, also contributing their own eely byproducts. A truly circular ecosystem in your drinking supply. One quirky tidbit for you, some historical accounts even suggest specific rituals or charms to ensure a well's purity, which probably worked about as well as a strongly worded letter to the local water sprites. Then there's rainwater, collected in barrels or cisterns. Sounds cleaner, right? Well, it depends on what it's washing off the roof. Bird droppings, soot, decaying leaves, maybe a bit of lead if your roof has any fancy flashing. It all adds to the unique, local flavor profile. And that's before we even get to what's living in that water, unseen. For centuries, the prevailing theory for disease was miasma, bad air. So, if the water didn't actively stink to high heaven, it was probably considered acceptable. The idea of tiny invisible creatures causing sickness was still a long way off. This brings us to the microscopic party happening in your cup. Bacteria like Vibrio cholera and T&D, the culprit behind cholera, could turn a bustling town into a ghost town with terrifying speed. Think of the famous case of Dr. John Snow and the Broad Street Pump in London in 1854. He meticulously mapped cholera cases and traced them back to a single contaminated public water pump, proving that the disease was waterborne, not airborne. This was a monumental step, a true mainstream historical fact that shifted public health thinking. But it took time for such knowledge to become widespread practice. Before that, you drank and you took your chances. Typhoid, dysentery. These were just unfortunate and frequent facts of life, often flaring up in the hot summer months when water levels were low and concentrations of everything were high. And it's not just bacteria, parasites. Oh, the delightful array of parasites Giardia, various charming intestinal worms, their eggs and cysts happily swirling in the water, just waiting for a new host. You might not see them, but a few days or weeks later, you'd certainly feel their presence. It's like an unwanted subscription box, delivered directly to your insides. Congratulations, you've got worms. Again, historians still argue whether the constant, low-level exposure to certain waterborne contaminants inadvertently built up a kind of grim resilience in some individuals, or if it simply led to a pervasive, chronic state of ill health across entire communities, subtly sapping strength and shortening lifespans. Beyond the biological hazards, let's talk pollutants. Remember those tanneries and dye works we mentioned earlier? Nestled charmingly by the riverbank, their processes often involved a cocktail of chemicals, things like arsenic, mercury, and chromium. And where did the wastewater go? straight into your potential drinking glass. Mining operations, even relatively small-scale ones, could leach heavy metals into streams for miles. Lead, from pipes a Roman specialty that continued in various forms or glazes on pottery, could also insidiously contaminate water. These weren't things that made you violently ill overnight, like cholera. No, these were the slow-burn contaminants, building up in your system, leading to chronic ailments, neurological problems, and a general feeling of being unwell that people just lived with. Just feeling a bit leady today, dear. So, this river soup wasn't just for drinking straight, though plenty of that happened. It was the base for everything. If you were making a pottage, that lovely simmering cauldron of whatever vegetables, grains, and perhaps a scrap of meat you had, well, the liquid component was your local water, complete with its unique microbial and chemical signature. Boiling the water for your stew would indeed kill many of the dangerous microorganisms, which was a definite plus. You're less likely to get instant dysentery from your boiled turnip water. However, boiling doesn't remove heavy metals or many chemical pollutants. In fact, as the water evaporates, those pollutants can become even more concentrated. So, your safety soup might be microbe-free but extra potent in the arsenic department. A delicious trade-off. Even washing your vegetables, if you were so inclined, involved this same water. A quick rinse might get the surface mud off, but it wouldn't do much for the invisible hitchhikers or the dissolved extras. And think about drinks beyond plain water. Ale and beer were popular, and often safer because the brewing process boiling the wort killed many germs. But small beer, with very low alcohol content, was common for daily hydration, and the water quality used to brew it still mattered. Wine was often diluted with water, a sensible practice to make it last longer and reduce public drunkenness. Perhaps, but if you're cutting your fine or not so fine wine with a splash of the local sewer adjacent stream, you're reintroducing all those exciting little extras. Herbal infusions, tisanes, medicinal teas, all started with a scoop from the nearest, easiest source. One hopes the medicinal properties of the herbs outweighed the adventurousness of the water. It's a wonder anyone had a calm stomach. Really. The original Gut Health Challenge, except you didn't sign up for it, and there were no celebrity endorsements, just the quiet gurgle of your own intestines, narrating your daily intake. And so, as you drift away from those thoughts of insert plausible detail from previous section, e.g., ancient granaries, and their constant battle against pests, you find your attention drawn to a different kind of transformation, one happening on a scale almost too small to see, yet powerful enough to shape civilizations. We're easing into the fascinating, and sometimes a little funky, world of fermentation. You can almost feel that gentle, invisible hum of activity, can't you? The quiet work of yeasts and bacteria, our microscopic chefs and preservers. Tonight, we're delving into how deeply humanity has relied, and still relies, on these tiny powerhouses, not just to keep food from spoiling, but to unlock entirely new universes of flavor. Before you had that sleek, silent refrigerator whispering sweet nothings in your kitchen, fermentation was your guardian against hunger. Your alchemist in the larder? It's a process so fundamental it's practically woven into our DNA, or at least into our oldest recipes. Think about it. That widespread reliance on fermentation for preservation, it's easy to take for granted now, with our vacuum sealers and freeze-dried camping meals. But for millennia, coaxing friendly microbes to set up shop in your food was the difference between a winter of plenty and one of gnawing scarcity. Imagine those crisp, cool autumn days, the harvest bounty piled high. You can almost smell the earth on the cabbages as they're shredded, salted, and packed tightly into a crock. Left to their own devices, they'd wilt and rot. But invite the right lactic acid bacteria to the party, and they begin their work, converting sugars into lactic acid, creating an environment where spoilage microbes just can't thrive. What emerges weeks or months later is sauerkraut, or kimchi if you're adding a fiery kick of chili and spice, tangy, crunchy, and vibrant with life. Ready to see you through the lean months. Remember how we touched upon the sheer difficulty of storing food long term. Like we mentioned earlier when discussing imagined previous section on food spoilage or ancient diets, fermentation was a game changer. And it wasn't just vegetables, milk, so wonderfully nutritious but oh so quick to turn, could be transformed. You can picture someone long ago, perhaps leaving a skin of milk a little too close to the fire, or maybe just in a particular vessel, and discovering that it hadn't spoiled, but thickened, soured, become something new. Yogurt, kefir, or the beginnings of cheese. That slightly tart, creamy tang, it's the taste of preservation, the taste of ingenuity. These weren't just new food items. They were survival strategies, carefully passed down. But let's be honest, while not starving is a pretty good perk, humans are also creatures of pleasure, always chasing that next delightful taste. And this is where fermentation truly shines, moving beyond mere utility into the realm of artistry. The widespread reliance on fermentation for flavor is just as profound. These microscopic artisans don't just preserve, they create, transform, elevate. Consider the humble loaf of bread. Unleavened, it's nos functional. But allow wild yeasts from the air and bacteria to colonize a simple mix of flour and water, and you get sourdough. That distinctive, complex tang, the airy crumb, the deeply browned crust that crackles when you slice into it. That's not just flour and water anymore. That's a living ecosystem that has gifted you an experience. You can almost smell that warm, yeasty aroma, can't you? It's a far cry from just, plain old bread. It's bread with personality, sometimes a very strong one. Then there's cheese. Oh, cheese. From the mildest, freshest curd to the most audacious, veiny blue. It's a spectrum of flavors and textures entirely sculpted by microbial action. Think of a creamy brie. Its rind a soft white plume of friendly fungus, or a hard-aged Parmesan, crystalline and sharp. Its complexity developed over months, even years, by diligent bacteria. Some of these creations smell like they could gently, but firmly suggest a bison reconsider its life choices. And yet, we seek them out. We pair them with wines. We celebrate their very existence. It's a bit baffling. Our love for these pungent marvels, isn't it? And we can't forget the liquids. Wine, beer, cider. These are ancient pleasures, born from the fermentation of fruit sugars and grain starches by yeasts. The transformation of simple grape juice into a complex vintage, or humble barley into a hearty ale. It's a kind of everyday magic. Or consider the deep, savory umami punch of soy sauce, miso, or tamari, all derived from soybeans undergoing a lengthy fermentation, a cornerstone of entire culinary traditions. Even your morning coffee and that decadent bar of chocolate owe their complex flavors, in part, to fermentation processes that the beans undergo after harvesting. Now, while this all sounds wonderfully idyllic, tiny helpers making our food last longer and taste amazing, there's a little shadow side we need to explore. Because these processes, especially in their early days, were often spectacularly uncontrolled. You're essentially throwing a microscopic party in your food storage and just hoping the guest list skews towards the beneficial. But what happens when the uninvited, or downright undesirable, microbes crash the gates? This is where the fun could turn a bit fraught. An uncontrolled fermentation process could easily introduce unexpected or undesirable microbes. Imagine you're aiming for that perfect batch of crisp pickles, but instead, the wrong bacteria take over, and you end up with a slimy, unappetizing mess. Or your carefully nurtured wine ferment starts producing, well, vinegar. Not bad if you want salad dressing, but a bit disappointing if you were planning a celebratory tipple. It's like inviting a skilled chef to your kitchen, but their rowdy, untalented cousin who only knows how to burn water tags along. You wanted a Michelin star. You got a smoke alarm serenade? Sometimes, these unexpected microbial guests would just lead to off flavors. A batch of beer that's a bit too sour, a cheese that's more aggressively foot-like than pleasantly pungent. You might wrinkle your nose, shrug, and try again, perhaps making a mental note about the temperature or the type of pot you used. But sometimes, the stakes were higher. If the conditions weren't just right, perhaps not acidic enough to inhibit the wrong crowd, or if a bit too much oxygen snuck in, you could be cultivating some genuinely problematic organisms. Pathogens could take hold, turning your preserved food from a lifesaver into a hidden danger. We're talking about things far more serious than just a bad taste. We're talking about foodborne illnesses, which, in a world without antibiotics, could be devastating. Botulism, for instance, thrives in anaerobic, low-acid environments, and it doesn't exactly announce its presence with a neon sign. This trial and error nature of early fermentation is quite something to ponder. It was the brilliant Louis Pasteur, way later in the 19th century, who truly illuminated the science behind it all. He meticulously demonstrated that specific microorganisms were responsible for specific types of fermentation and also for spoilage. Before Pasteur, it was all a bit of inspired guesswork, a blend of tradition, observation, and perhaps a fair amount of prayer. He helped transform fermentation from what seemed like a mystical art into a more predictable science, much to the relief of French winemakers who were tired of their precious vintages turning sour. And speaking of less controlled, and perhaps more adventurous fermentations, consider the ancient Roman delicacy, garum. This prized fish sauce was made by layering fish, often including all their entrails, with salt in large clay jars, and then leaving them out in the Mediterranean sun for months to liquefy and ferment. You can just imagine the aroma, can't you? It must have been, let's say, quite assertive. Some accounts suggest that garum production facilities were often located downwind of populated areas, which seems like a profoundly considerate and entirely necessary piece of urban planning. Yet, this pungent liquid was incredibly valuable, used as a condiment much like soy sauce is today. As for how these fermentation processes were even discovered in the first place, well, historians still argue whether the earliest leavened bread or the first intentionally alcoholic beverages were the result of pure serendipitous accident, perhaps a forgotten pot of porridge left out a little too long on a warm day, or if they represented a spark of deliberate, albeit very early, scientific inquiry by some Stone Age foodie. This constant tightrope walk between a successful, delicious fermentation and, a biological oopsie eventually led to more refined techniques. The idea of a starter culture, taking a bit of a good, successful batch to inoculate the next one, was a huge leap. It's like having a bouncer for your microbial party, ensuring only the VIP yeasts and bacteria get in. You see this today with cherished sourdough starters, some lovingly fed and maintained for generations, each with its own unique character, and often a rather dramatic family history. Even so, spontaneous fermentation, relying on the wild, ambient microbes unique to a place, still holds a certain allure. Think of traditionally made lambic beers from Belgium, or some natural wines, where the environment itself dictates the microbial cast of characters. It's definitely riskier, the results more variable, but when it clicks, the complexity and a sense of place that terroir extending to the invisible world, can be truly extraordinary. It's as if the universe itself decided to add a little pinch of its own unique spice. Ultimately, this whole history of fermentation is a powerful testament to our ancestors' keen observational skills, their incredible patience, and let's be frank, probably their remarkably resilient digestive systems. They were the original biohackers, learning to coax and cajole these invisible life forms into not just preserving their precious food, but transforming it into something new, something delicious, something that spoke of culture and place, long before we had perfectly calibrated temperature controls, or, indeed, the ability to leave a scathing one-star review if the mead wasn't quite up to par. It's a quiet, ongoing collaboration, a dance between human intention and microbial will, that continues to nourish and delight us, even now, in our softly lit rooms. And so, as you drift from those thoughts of, shall we say, enthusiastically fermented grains, let's gently pivot our attention. We've touched on how things are grown, how they're stored. Remember those slightly damp, slightly hopeful granaries we explored a while back? But now, let's consider the less glamorous side, the bits and pieces often left behind, or perhaps, more accurately, the bits and pieces that are, shall we say, processed through an animal before they find a new, and sometimes surprising purpose, particularly around your food. We're venturing into the world of animal byproducts, those unexpected ingredients that often work their magic quietly, behind the scenes, or sometimes, quite literally, under the cooking pot. Imagine, for a moment, the primary source of fuel for cooking in many, many cultures, for millennia. It's not a neatly chopped log or a convenient gas hob. No, you're looking at dried animal dung. Yes, that. You see it stacked neatly, like dark, earthy briquettes, baking in the sun. The scent, once it's burning, is distinctive. It's a pungent, smoky aroma that doesn't just heat the food, it becomes part of the food. Think of flatbreads, patted out by hand and cooked on a hot stone over a dung fire. That smoky tang, that slightly acrid note at the back of your throat, that's the signature of the fuel. It really gives a whole new meaning to farm to table, doesn't it? More like farm to fire to fume to food. Now, while it's easy for us, with our sterile kitchens, to wrinkle our noses for a vast portion of human history, and even today in many parts of the world, this was and is a vital resource, efficient, readily available, and a fantastic recycler of energy. The mainstream historical fact here, of course, is that civilizations across the globe, from the plains of Africa to the steppes of Asia, relied heavily on dried animal dung as a primary fuel source, a practice that continues in many rural communities. The indirect impact on food flavor is undeniable. A smoky patina layered onto every meal. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of dung fuel significantly altered regional cuisines through this pervasive smoke permeation, or if palates simply adapted over generations, accepting that particular smoky essence as just how food tastes. You can almost imagine an ancient food critic. Yes, a delightful hint of burnt yak. 5 stars. The practicalities were, of course, paramount. You used what you had, and if what you had was a field full of, well, future fuel cakes, then that's what simmered your stew. But it's not just about what goes under the pot. Let's talk about what might go into it, or at least, into the things that go into it. Consider bones, ground down. They become bone meal. A fertilizer, that's an indirect link to your food, boosting the crops. But bones also give us bone char. This is charred animal bone, used for centuries, and sometimes still today, to filter and decolorize sugar, giving you that pristine white sweetness. You might not see bone char on the ingredient list of your sugar packet, but its ghostly presence might have been there, ensuring your sugar isn't, well, it's more natural beige. Then we have the famous trio hooves, hides, and horns. Boiled down, rendered, purified, they give us gelatin. Yes, that wonderfully wobbly, jiggly substance that forms the basis of so many desserts, aspics, and even the capsules for your vitamins. You picture those shimmering, translucent jellies, perhaps studded with fruit, so innocent and delightful. It's a far cry from a leathery hide or a tough hoof, isn't it? The transformation is quite something. It's a reminder, like we mentioned when discussing ancient preservation techniques, that our ancestors were masters of using every single part of an animal. Nothing went to waste if it could be helped. The quirky tidbit here is that the Victorians were surprisingly keen on jellies made from calves' feet, not just for the delightful wobble, but because they genuinely believed these concoctions, laboriously prepared, were brimming with easily digestible nutrients, perfect for the infirm or those with delicate constitutions. So, the next time you're enjoying a particularly wobbly dessert, just remember, you might be having a very close encounter with what was once part of a hoof or a hide. Sweet dreams. And what about cheese? That glorious diverse world of cheese. How do you get milk to separate so beautifully into curds and whey for millennia? The answer has often been rennet, and rennet traditionally comes from the lining of a young ruminant's stomach. Think calves, lambs, or kids. These young animals have an enzyme, chymosin, perfect for curdling their mother's milk. The discovery was likely accidental. Someone, long ago, probably stored milk in a pouch made from an animal stomach. And lo and behold, cheese happened. It's a cornerstone of traditional cheesemaking. Of course, today we have microbial and plant-based rennets, but the animal-derived original has a legacy that stretches back into the mists of culinary time. The taste of your favorite traditional cheddar or parmesan owes a tiny nod to that specific biological process. Let's not forget our beverages. You're sipping a wonderfully clear, bright beer or a crisp glass of white wine. Ever wonder how it gets so brilliantly transparent, free of any haze? Sometimes the secret ingredient is isinglass. And isinglass is a type of collagen derived from the dried swim bladders of fish. Yes, fish bladders. It's a fining agent, meaning it helps to collect and settle out yeast particles and other cloudy bits, leaving your drink sparkling. It's been used for centuries. While it's largely removed from the final product, tiny traces can remain, which is why some strict vegetarians and vegans avoid beers and wines fined with it. Suddenly, that crystal clear pint of your favorite artisanal ale might seem a little, well, fishy. And not just because of the price you paid for it at that trendy new gastropub. It's another one of those hidden helpers derived from an animal byproduct, working its clarifying magic in the vats and barrels, long before the drink reaches your appreciative lips. These aren't ingredients you'd typically highlight on the front of the package. Are they now with extra hoof extract, or flavored with authentic dung smoke? It doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Yet, these substances, born from what many might consider waste, or at least the less palatable parts of an animal, have played, and in some cases, continue to play, a crucial role in shaping the textures, the clarity, and even the subtle background notes of the foods and drinks we consume. It's a testament to human ingenuity and our long, often complex relationship with the animal kingdom. Finding utility, and even a strange kind of culinary poetry, in the most unexpected of places. You begin to see how deeply interwoven these animal elements are, not just as the main course, but as the quiet facilitators of our food experiences. A subtle undercurrent in the river of what we eat and drink. It makes you pause, doesn't it? To think about the journey of every component, every subtle influence, before it reaches your plate or your glass. Right. So after navigating the thrilling world of questionable ingredients, and, let's be honest, the ever-present possibility of yesterday's leftovers making a surprise reappearance, you'd think the culinary challenges would end there. But oh no, my friend. That's just the appetizer to a whole new course of, well, let's call them unintentional garnishes. We're diving into the delightful realm of accidental additions, the non-food surprises that could frequently, and I mean frequently, end up simmering away in that pot right alongside your, gourmet meal. You see, food preparation back then wasn't quite the sterile, hermetically sealed process we're used to today. Forget your cling film and your Tupperware, your quality-controlled factories. You're dealing with much more rustic materials. Think about how your grains or dried beans might arrive, probably in a rough burlap sack, or maybe something woven from hemp or coarse linen. As you scoop out your portion, it's almost inevitable that little fibers, tiny threads from the sack itself, decide to join the party. They're small, easily missed, and probably just blend into the texture of whatever gruel or stew is on the menu. You might not even notice them, or if you do, you just sort of pick them out or swallow them with a philosophical shrug. It's not like you can send a complaint to customer service. Excuse me, I found a bit of sack in my pottage. 010 would not recommend. Good luck with that. Then there's the packaging for other goods, liquids, like oil or wine. If you're lucky enough to have them in quantity, might be stored in wooden barrels or clay amphorae. Now, wooden barrels, especially older ones, can splinter. Tiny shards of wood, almost invisible, could flake off into the contents, especially if the barrel is being scraped to get the last dregs. And clay pots? Well, clay can chip. A little bump, a careless knock, and a tiny ceramic fragment could fall into the flour bin or the water jug. These aren't necessarily sharp, dangerous pieces all the time, but more like a gritty, unwelcome texture. It's like when you get that one grain of sand in your salad that somehow made it through 20 washes. Annoying, but on a much more regular basis. And remember those less than ideal storage conditions we touched upon. Dampness could make wooden containers swell and splinter, or cause labels made of parchment or papyrus, if such a luxury even existed for your particular goods, to disintegrate and bits to fall in. Now, let's move from the packaging to the tools of the trade. Your kitchen implements aren't exactly gleaming stainless steel, are they? You're likely working with wooden spoons, maybe a roughly hewn wooden bowl for mixing. Wood, as we know, splinters. Stirring a thick bubbling concoction over that open fire we talked about, day in and day out, puts a lot of stress on a simple wooden spoon. Little slivers could break off and vanish into the stew. Extra fiber, you might joke to yourself if you're feeling particularly optimistic. And then there are the stones. If you're grinding your own grain, perhaps with a smaller, domestic cornstone, those two circular stones, one rotating on the other. Remember debts? Well, those stones wear down. It's inevitable. Tiny particles of grit, little flecks of stone, mixed directly with the flour. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was practically guaranteed. In fact, it's a well-documented mainstream historical fact that grit in bread from stone grinding was so common in ancient Egypt that it led to significant tooth wear, visible in mummified remains. Imagine your daily bread literally grinding down your teeth over your lifetime. It really gave a new meaning to eating your minerals, didn't it? though perhaps not the ones your doctor recommends today. So, that crunchy texture in your bread or porridge, not always a delightfully toasted seed. Sometimes it's just rock, metal tools, if you had them, weren't immune either. An iron knife, if not meticulously cared for, and who has the time for meticulous when you're just trying to get food ready, could develop rust. Flakes of iron oxide could easily transfer to the food you're chopping, or perhaps a small metal skewer, or the tip of a much-mended utensil, weakened by repeated heating and cooling, might just snap off into the pot. Imagine biting into your stew and finding the business end of your cook's favorite whittling knife. "Oh, that's where that went," she'd exclaim, probably with more relief at finding the tool bit than concern for your dental work. Beyond the things you put in or near the food, there's the whole environment to consider. If your cooking area is open to the elements, or even just a bit drafty, which it almost certainly is, the wind is a generous contributor. Dust, tiny leaves, bits of dried grass, ash from the fire swirling around, all of these can, and do, land in the simmering pot. It's like an involuntary seasoning from Mother Nature herself. And let's not forget the six-legged or eight-legged uninvited guests. An ant marching determinedly across the preparation surface might take a wrong turn. A fly, drawn to the enticing aromas, might perform a final, fatal dive. Think of it as extra protein. Or, don't. Probably best not to. But it happened. These little critters were just a part of the culinary landscape. Animal hair is another fun addition. If you have dogs, cats, or even livestock wandering nearby, their hairs can float on the breeze and settle everywhere, including the food. You probably try to keep them away, but animals have a knack for getting where they're not wanted, especially if food is involved. It's not like you have a HEPA filter running in the background. A particularly quirky, or perhaps just grimly practical as an aspect of this whole situation is highlighted by finds from places like Pompeii. When archaeologists examined some of the carbonized loaves of bread preserved by the volcanic eruption, analysis sometimes revealed the impurities they contained, including tiny fragments of the millstones used to grind the flour. It wasn't just a hypothesis, it was baked right in. In fact, in medieval London, there were actually regulations against bakers who sold bread with excessive amounts of foreign matter, suggesting it was a recognized problem and one that authorities, at least sometimes, tried to address, probably with varying degrees of success. You can just imagine the medieval equivalent of a food inspector, sighing deeply as they sift through yet another suspect loaf. So, you're sitting down to your meal, a meal that's already a bit of a gamble, as we've discussed. And now, you're also playing a game of, what's that crunch? Or, is this string supposed to be here? It's a far cry from our modern expectations of food purity. We get upset if there's a slightly bruised apple in the bag. They were dealing with a whole different league of Of course, the human body is surprisingly resilient, and people undoubtedly developed a certain tolerance, or at least a practiced ability, to eat around the more obvious contaminants. But it does make you wonder about the long-term effects of ingesting small amounts of stone, wood, or fibers, day after day. The perception of these accidental additions is also fascinating. Historians still argue whether the occasional discovery of, say, a small lost button from someone's clothing, or a colorful bead that slipped its string and found its way into a communal bowl, was met with utter disgust, a simple shrug of resignation given the circumstances, or perhaps even seen as a curious, albeit inedible, omen. Was it bad luck, good luck, or just Tuesday? We, with our modern sensibilities, might be horrified, but when your baseline for clean is so different, Perhaps your reaction to a bit of twig in your soup is also quite different. It's not ideal, sure, but it's probably not going to stop you from eating if you're hungry. And you are, almost certainly, very hungry. These little surprises, these bits and pieces of the world that inadvertently became part of the meal, just add another layer to the already complex tapestry of historical foodways. It's a reminder that survival often meant overlooking the small stuff, even if that small stuff was a piece of actual stuff in your food. You just hoped it wasn't too big or too sharp. And as you chewed, carefully, you might ponder the source of that unexpected texture, a tiny memento from the journey your food took to reach your bowl. Delicious, right? Well, maybe not delicious, but certainly memorable. And so, you find yourself past the point of simple inconvenience, beyond the temporary pangs we touched upon when discussing those dwindling emergency rations. Remember that feeling, the slight grumble in your belly, the passing thought of your next meal. That's child's play now. We're venturing into a different territory altogether, a place where hunger isn't just a feeling. It's your entire world, your relentless, all-consuming companion. This is the realm where hunger trumps taste. And frankly, it trumps just about everything else, too. Your mind, once a vibrant tapestry of thoughts, dreams, and perhaps even anxieties about things like, oh, I don't know, social etiquette or your favorite sports team, now has a singular, glaring focus food: calories, sustenance. It's like a faulty neon sign in a desolate landscape, flickering, eat, 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 endlessly. Your ability to concentrate on anything else dwindles to almost nothing. Those complex problem-solving skills you prided yourself on, they are now dedicated to figuring out if that peculiar root is edible, or how to get to those berries guarded by an alarmingly territorial badger. You become irritable, a shadow of your former, perhaps more jovial self. Patience wears thin, not because you're a bad person, but because every cell in your body is screaming for fuel. It's like that hangry feeling some of us get when we skip lunch, but magnified 1,000 times, stretched out over weeks, maybe months. Your grand plans for post-apocalyptic societal reform, yeah, those are on hold. Right now, inventing a way to make tree bark taste vaguely like yesterday's forgotten pizza crust is the Nobel Prize-worthy endeavor. Physically, it's a slow, insidious decline. The initial gnawing in your stomach, the one you might have tried to ignore, becomes a constant, dull ache. It's a hollow feeling that water can't fill and sleep can't fully erase. You feel a profound weakness seeping into your limbs. Lifting things, even moving with your previous agility, becomes a monumental effort. Remember that carefully constructed shelter we talked about needing repairs. The thought of exerting that energy is almost unbearable. Your body, in its desperate wisdom, starts to conserve energy in any way it can. You might feel perpetually cold, even on warmer days, as your metabolism slows to a crawl. Your muscles, no longer receiving enough protein, begin to waste away. You see it in the mirror, if you dare to look, a goner face, sharper angles where there were once softer curves. It's a stark, unwelcome reminder that you are, quite literally, running on empty. And what happens to your refined palate, your appreciation for a well-seasoned dish, a pleasing texture? Well, that sophisticated diner within you quietly packs its bags and leaves without so much as a forwarding address. Taste becomes an almost forgotten luxury. The primary question is no longer, does it taste good? Is it remotely digestible? Will it provide calories? You find yourself contemplating and then consuming. Things that would have made you recoil in disgust in your previous life, Blandness is a blessing if it means a full stomach, or at least a less empty one. Bitter herbs that make your face pucker. You chew them slowly, hoping they harbor some hidden nutrient. Gritty, tough, slimy. These are just new adjectives in your culinary vocabulary. That piece of dried leather, perhaps from an old shoe or a strap, might be boiled for hours, hoping to extract some minuscule hint of nourishment. It's not about enjoyment. It's about staving off the inevitable for one more day. Suddenly, that weird, unidentifiable casserole your aunt brings to every family gathering doesn't seem quite so horrifying, does it? Perspective is a funny thing. Safety, too, becomes a negotiable concept. The caution you once exercised, the careful consideration of risks, begins to erode under the relentless pressure of starvation. You might find yourself eyeing plants you're not entirely sure about, taking a small, hopeful bite, waiting to see if it brings relief or a fresh wave of agony. That mushroom looks interesting. Is it a delicious morsel? Or a one-way ticket to a very unpleasant end? The calculation becomes terrifyingly simple. The risk of potential poisoning versus the certainty of continued starvation. During the siege of Leningrad, a truly harrowing chapter of modern history, people were driven to eat wallpaper paste because the starch in it offered some caloric value, or they'd boil leather belts and shoes. The body's demand for fuel can make you incredibly, dangerously brave, or perhaps just incredibly desperate. You start to view that suspiciously plump pigeon, the one that used to just be part of the urban scenery, with a newfound respect and a detailed, if somewhat rudimentary, culinary plan. Animal welfare groups would certainly not approve, but then again, they aren't here, and your stomach is currently staging a protest louder than any activist's megaphone. You might even see echoes of this desperation in historical markers, like the hunger stones found in some European rivers. These are rocks embedded in riverbeds, carved with dates and messages that only become visible during extreme droughts, warning of the famine that inevitably followed. Imagine seeing such a stone emerge, a stark, historical "you're here" on the map of suffering. Historians still argue whether the extreme choices made during prolonged starvation, like the consumption of things that were once considered inedible or even taboo, things far beyond just questionable plants, stemmed from a complete erosion of societal norms, or if the primal drive for survival simply overwrites all other programming in the human brain. It's a chilling thought. This stripping away of everything but the most basic, urgent need, the higher functions, the philosophical ponderings, the appreciation of art or music, they all fade into the background hum of that one dominant, overriding imperative: find food, consume food, survive. It's a stark reminder that beneath all our layers of civilization, we are at our core biological machines that need fuel to run. And when that fuel runs out, the machine will do almost anything to find more. Right then, after years, perhaps even decades, of navigating this rather unique culinary landscape, you begin to notice the slow, creeping accumulation of its effects. It's not like a sudden illness, a dramatic collapse. No, this is more insidious, a gradual wearing down, like water dripping on stone. Each meal, each sip, a tiny contribution to a larger, unseen erosion within you. You feel it in your bones, this long-term toll, that persistent ache in your joints, the one you used to blame on a hard day's work or a damp evening, now feels like a constant companion, a dull throb that hums just beneath the surface of your awareness. Remember that slightly metallic tang we sometimes talked about, perhaps from the pewter tankards or the glaze on cheaper pottery over time? That subtle taste translates into something less definable, a heaviness in your head, a fog that never quite lifts. Your thoughts move a little slower, like wading through treacle. It's not just tiredness, it's a deeper, more profound lethargy. Your body, you see, has been diligently absorbing not just the intended sustenance, but also those little extras, the trace heavy metals, the residues from poorly cleaned cooking vessels, the nearly invisible spores from grain that wasn't quite dry enough when stored. We've discussed how common ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, was in communities reliant on rye bread. Imagine the terror of those burning sensations, the convulsions, or worse, the slow creeping gangrene, all from a fungus on your daily bread. While you might escape such a dramatic fate, the lower level mycotoxins from other molds, day in and day out, they work their own quiet mischief on your liver, on your immune system, your gut. Well, let's just say it's seen better days. It's probably hosting a very subdued, slightly confused party down there, never quite settling, always a bit gurgly. And then there's the matter of what's missing. You know that feeling when you're craving something, but you don't know what it is. Imagine that, but as a constant, gnawing background hum. Your diet, often monotonous and heavily reliant on what's available rather than what's optimal, starts to carve out deficiencies. Perhaps your gums bleed a little too easily when you're chewing on that tough bit of salted meat. A small thing, you might think, but then you notice old scratches take longer to heal, and you bruise like a ripe peach. Hello, scurvy, my old friend, or at least its less dramatic, chronic cousin. You're not on a 6-month sea voyage, but the lack of fresh greens and fruits, especially through the long winters, takes its toll. Your teeth might feel a bit loose in their sockets. Not ideal when your main source of protein requires some serious dental commitment. You look at the children, if there are any around you. Some might have legs that bow a little, a testament to bones that didn't quite harden properly. That's rickets, a cruel sculptor, shaping young bodies with a lack of sunlight and, crucially, vitamin D, often scarce in diets, heavy on grains and preserved foods, with little access to fresh, oily fish or dairy, if dairy is even safe or plentiful. For you, as an adult, it might manifest as that deep bone pain we mentioned, or a tendency for bones to fracture a little too easily from a simple fall. Your energy levels are perpetually low. It's not just the hard work, it's an iron-deficient weariness, a paleness to your skin that no amount of pinched cheeks can truly hide. You might find yourself short of breath after even minor exertion. The world just feels heavier. The reliance on questionable ingredients, those fillers and extenders we've touched upon, also plays its part. Remember the suspicion that the flour was a bit too gritty, or that the bread seemed unnaturally white. Chalk, alum, sawdust. These weren't exactly superfoods, while a single dose might just lead to an upset stomach. Consuming these adulterants regularly, even in small amounts, places a constant, low-grade stress on your digestive system, on your kidneys, on your body's ability to absorb what little good nutrition is present. It's like trying to run a fine engine on dirty fuel. Eventually, something starts to sputter. Historians still argue whether the apparent hardiness of members of people from these times was a genuine resilience, or if a higher tolerance for discomfort and a general acceptance of chronic ailments simply masked widespread, quiet suffering. You might find your skin is often dry, perhaps a little flaky, or prone to rashes that take an age to clear. Minor infections seem to linger. Your hair might lack luster. Your nails might be brittle. These aren't life-threatening emergencies, not usually. They are the quiet, cumulative whispers of a body struggling to maintain itself on an inadequate and often contaminated fuel source. It's the physical manifestation of air making do for far too long. That quirky old saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, good luck finding a fresh, crisp apple year-round, let alone one that hasn't been bruised and stored in a less than ideal root cellar for months. Its vital nutrients slowly seeping away, and those agues and fevers that fill the old parish records. Such vague terms could cover a multitude of sins, many of them undoubtedly rooted in the chronic undernourishment and toxic burdens we're discussing. It's a slow decline, not a fast one, but the direction is unmistakably, relentlessly, downwards. You adapt, you endure, because what other choice is there? But the price is paid in the currency of your own vitality, one compromised meal at a time. And so, you find yourself here, at the quiet edge of our long wander through times past, ready to look back from the comfort of your own kitchen, your own plate. You can almost feel the phantom weight of the scythe, can't you? Or perhaps the lingering, earthy scent of the pottage we spent so much time imagining. Now, let's gently overlay that world with your own. You open your refrigerator, a marvel of modern engineering, its cool breath a stark contrast to the root cellars or simple larders of old. Inside, a kaleidoscope of colors and options from across the globe awaits. Strawberries in December. No problem. Avocados from continents away. Aisle 3. For the medieval peasant, such choice would be utterly bewildering, like sorcery. Their world, as we've seen, was intensely local. What grew in their village, or what they could painstakingly cultivate in their own small garden plot, was what filled their bowls. Seasonality wasn't a trendy dietary choice. It was an unbreakable law. You crave fresh greens in the dead of winter well. You might get some preserved cabbage if you were lucky. That vibrant, crisp salad you just picked up from the supermarket simply didn't exist in their reality. It's a mainstream historical fact that bread in its many forms, coarse, dark, and dense, was the cornerstone of the peasant diet. Mandul, often accounting for up to 80% of their daily caloric intake. It was the fuel for their relentless labor. You know, back then, artisanal sourdough was just bread, and the artisan was probably just very, very tired, not a lifestyle influencer. Today, you might choose whole grain for its health benefits. For them, whole grain was all there was, the bran and germ included, because nothing could be wasted. This meant their diet, by default, was high in fiber, something we often strive for. But let's not romanticize it too much. While we select our organic, stone-ground flour, their grains could be contaminated with grit from the millstone, or worse, the dreaded ergot fungus we touched upon, leading to sickness and hallucinations. Modern food practices have also brought us an overwhelming array of processed foods. You can grab a meal that's ready in minutes, packed with flavors engineered to be irresistible. The peasant's convenience food was perhaps leftover pottage, eaten cold, or a hunk of that dense bread. Hours were spent grinding grain, simmering the perpetual stew, baking, brewing. Their food was, by necessity, whole and minimally processed. But this didn't always equate to healthy in our modern sense. Vitamin deficiencies, like scurvy from a lack of fresh produce in winter, were common. Historians still argue whether the average peasant's nutritional intake was consistently sufficient, or if they lived in a perpetual state of near malnutrition, punctuated by periods of acute famine. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That constant, gnawing uncertainty about the next meal. And then there's food safety. You glance at an expiration date, a best buy suggestion, and make a judgment call. Imagine a world without such guidance, without refrigeration to slow the relentless march of decay. Preservation was key for survival. Salting, smoking, pickling, drying. These methods, while ingenious, were not foolproof. Meat, a rare luxury, could be tainted. Milk would sour quickly. Water itself was often suspect. which, as we've noted, is a primary reason why ale and small beer were such staples. The brewing process killing off many harmful microbes. Their version of a food safety inspector was probably just the village dog refusing to eat something. A pretty reliable, if slightly slobbery system. Consider the humble trencher. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that these plates, often made of stale bread, would soak up the juices of whatever was served on them. After the meal, the gravy-soaked trencher might be eaten by the diner, given to the dogs, or distributed to the poorer folk waiting outside. It's a stark example of the waste not, want not ethos, but also a potential hygiene minefield by today's standards. Can you imagine the bacterial load on a communal, repeatedly used bread plate? We, on the other hand, have stringent regulations, health inspections, and an understanding of germ theory that would have seemed like mystical knowledge. We worry about cross-contamination on our sanitized cutting boards, while they contended with a daily barrage of invisible threats. We debate organic versus conventional. They just hoped the harvest wouldn't fail and the rats wouldn't get into the grain stores. This brings us to a quiet reflection on the sheer resilience and resourcefulness that defined their existence. It wasn't a choice. It was the fundamental requirement for seeing the next sunrise. Think of the ingenuity required to make so much from so little. Every scrap was utilized. Animal bones would be boiled for broth until they yielded no more nourishment. Worn-out clothes would be patched, then repatched, then turned into rags. Foraging wasn't a weekend hobby. It was a critical supplement to their diet, demanding an intimate knowledge of the local landscape, which berries were safe, which mushrooms wouldn't kill you, which roots could be boiled into something edible. Remember our discussions about the commons and how vital access to those shared lands was for firewood, grazing, and foraging. That was their lifeline. You face a minor inconvenience. Your Wi-Fi drops, your favorite coffee shop is closed, and it can feel like a major disruption. Now, picture facing a failed harvest, knowing there's no supermarket to turn to, no government aid package on its way. Picture the physical toll of plowing a field with a heavy wooden plow, often pulled by an ox, or, if you were less fortunate, by family members. From dawn till dusk, this wasn't getting your steps in. This was survival. Their bodies were machines fueled by meager rations, yet they built cathedrals, cleared forests, and laid the foundations of the world we inhabit. There's a deep, almost cellular knowledge they possessed. How to read the weather, how to manage livestock with minimal resources, how to make and mend tools. This resourcefulness wasn't just practical, it was a mindset, a way of seeing the world where every object held potential. Every challenge demanded a creative solution. If a medieval peasant saw us despair over a smartphone battery dying, they'd probably just laugh gently and then go back to, ensuring their family had enough gruel for the evening. It's a humbling perspective, isn't it? To realize the immense, quiet strength that ran through these communities, these individuals who lived lives so unimaginably hard by our standards, yet still found ways to endure, to create, to even celebrate. As we saw in their festivals and brief moments of respite, their lives were a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit. And now, as our journey through these shadowed fields and smoky hearths comes to a gentle close, allow the images to soften, to recede like the setting sun over a medieval landscape. The sounds of the village, the distant lowing of cattle, the murmur of voices around a flickering fire, all begin to fade into a peaceful quietude. You can feel the day's labors settling in your own limbs, a comfortable, sleepy weight. The resilience we've pondered, the resourcefulness we've admired, these were born of necessity, but they also speak to a profound connection with the rhythms of the earth, a connection we often seek in our own bustling, brightly lit world. Let the echoes of their lives be a soft lullaby, a reminder of the deep, enduring strength that lies within the human story, within you. Rest now, drift easily, and carry that quiet strength into your dreams. Sleep well. Sleep